All right, everybody have your smart goggles on? Me too. Okay, so we are going to review for the test today. So you have several things to do. The first thing you have to do is you have to watch this video in entirety. Watch the whole thing. The second thing you have to do is complete your study guide. Remember that you need to either make a copy of it or you need to take down some answers on a blank sheet of paper, but you need to do it. When you're done, you're going to watch a video of me. That's the third thing, going over your study guide with you and kind of discussing it. Don't skip through the video just to get the answers. Yes, Mrs. Tomlinson knows you've done this. Do not skip the video just through the answer just to get the answers. Make sure you understand it, okay? Highlight anything you come across that you want me to talk about more, circle things, star things, whatever. Make sure that you're prepared to ask at least one question when we come together before the test. Okay, so to start studying for the test, you'll need to open your notebook to page 90. So please, I will give you a minute to open your notebook to page 90. All right, let's start on page 90. What's really important is we make sure that we read our learning targets. So our first learning target for this unit is I can compare modern and fossil organisms to infer anatomic evolutionary relationships. So our first term here was evolution. You should have that highlighted and underlined. And it should say the theory based on the idea that all species are related and gradually change over time. And then you should have some form of fossil that looks like some form of organism pasted here or drawn here on this page. And then I asked you to answer the questions about modern organisms and what or why you think that it might be related to a modern day organism. So you should have something like this. You should have something that says the fossil skeleton resembles that of and I thought it was a modern day gray squirrel. It's possible that the gray squirrel and this fossil skeleton could be related. They have similar bone structures and similar skulls. If two or more species share a unique physical feature, like a skull, such as a complex bone structure or body plan, they may all have inherited this feature from a common ancestor. So the idea that they may somehow be related is included in the theory of evolution. And so you could have something like that written on page 90. Does anyone have any questions about this page? Okay, let's turn it. Let's look at 91. These words are really big, so I hope you've been studying, okay? So our learning target for 91 was I can explain how it is possible for scientists to study animals or plants that existed millions of years ago. Our key terms were fossils and trace fossils. These should be highlighted and underlined. I asked you to write 3 to 5 examples of trace fossils here. Some examples of trace fossils are tracks, trails, burrows, borings, gnawings, eggs, nests, gizzard stones, and dung. Yes, poop. Then I wanted to know what's the difference between fossils and trace fossils and why it's important for scientists to be able to study both types of fossil evidence. And the reason there is that the difference between body fossils, which are fossilized bones that preserve records from the moment of an organism's death, and trace fossils, which are evidence of life in the past, is that trace fossils give glimpses into everyday activities, such as walking, crawling, burrowing, and feeding. Both types of fossils are important for scientists to study to reconstruct life and activity in the distant past. Okay? Any questions on page 91, or do you want me to talk more about it? Okay. Page 92. All right, I can analyze pictorial data to identify patterns in the fossil record. So this thing right here, this is the fossil record. You should have fossil record written, highlighted, underlined, and defined. You should have written that the simple life forms are here and the complex life forms are a little bit more recent. I asked you, using the fossil record, to explain what appears to have happened over time to body structures and sizes of organisms on Earth. Include a statement regarding complexity. So what you should have written, or similarly written to address that, was the fossil record shows that as time passes, organisms have become more complex. Evidence from the fossil record finds organisms gaining arms, legs, lungs, teeth, wings, tails, and fur, etc. The life forms become larger and more diverse forms of life begin to appear and evolve into the organisms that we see today. All right, turn your page to 93. I hope you colored this. If you colored this and took the time to color this, you got an absolute gold star for today. Our learning target was, I can use rock layers to figure out information about geologic time and understand how scientists have figured out where and when different organisms existed. So this fossil first came into existence in layer 2. So we have a 2 there. The oldest fossil existed in layer 1. This is the oldest one at the bottom layer. The fossil that existed the longest is this swirly one, 1, 2, 3, right? Existed 3 times. And the newest fossil existed in layer 4. That top layer is newest. The bottom layer is oldest. Okay? Any questions about that? All right, make sure you have page 93 in your notebook there, and let's turn the page. All right, I can analyze anatomical data to identify patterns that infer relationships of species using comparative embryology. That was a mouthful, right? So really, we're looking at the body shapes of embryos and comparing them, okay? And so I asked you to predict the animal, whether it's a human, a chicken, a rabbit, a tortoise, a salamander, or a fish. And I hope you just were like, oh my gosh, I just can't. And then you're like, maybe I can. But you clearly could not possibly get these correct because they are so similar in this early stage of development. You could not possibly get these correct. Okay, so one of them is a human, one of them is a chicken, one of them is a rabbit, one of them is a tortoise, one of them is a salamander, and one of them is a fish. And hopefully you put those, what you predicted, down there. You can actually Google embryology and you can find the answers, but I'm not going to tell you because it's just more fun that way. So then I asked you, what body structures do embryos of different species share in early development, and whether or not you think this is a coincidence, and what does it suggest about the possibility of all species having a common ancestor? And so an answer might be that the body structures that embryos of different species share in the early stages of development include an eye, backbone, a tail, and very similar head structures. This is probably not a coincidence and suggests a possible common ancestor that all species came from that may have changed over time. Definitely a possibility. All right, let's turn the page. All right, we did a little investigation. We looked at some pictures of similar body structures of organisms in multiple species in the early stages of development. That was the pictures of the embryos that we just looked at on notebook page 94. And hopefully in A, your similarities were that they all have the same shape and they look like one cell with a dark spot in the middle. And for B, they all look like they have more than one cell with a dark spot in the middle, and they're similar in shape and size. And C, all of them appear to have an eye, a backbone, a tail, and a head structure. And then, so this is as they develop more and more. And D, all still appear to have an eye, a backbone, a tail, head structure, and some kind of limb. And then on E, they all have limbs, like some form of limb, a head, a mouth, and eyes. And when you looked at them, I asked what patterns you saw, and hopefully you said something like this. When looking at the embryos in the earliest stages, we see that they all appear to be developing at a similar rate, are similar shapes, sizes, and have similar physical features. These are patterns. This evidence supports the idea that multiple species have similar body structures in early stages of development, but as the species grows and develops, it gradually changes over time. It might mean that all species are related and have a common ancestor that had different physical features. So possibly related because they have very interesting similar structures in very early development. Notebook page 96, I understand that natural selection may lead to an increases and decreases of a specific trait over time. So it talked about natural selections and traits. Hopefully you have those written and defined, highlighted and underlined. I asked you to draw a scenario that leads to an adaptation by natural selection and explain why a trait helps an animal or plant live longer will become more common in the population. This becomes really complicated to explain, so let's look at this example together. This is also in your learning targets, just in case. So I put one together for an ostrich, and an ostrich has a certain kind of bill, and the bill helps the ostrich gets rid of excess body heat. It has like huge nostrils, right? During the hottest hours of the day. So the larger the holes are in the nostril, the better adapted it would be to its environment, right? The eyes, huge eyes can help it identify predators. So if it had smaller eyes, it might not be able to see a predator in time and get eaten, right? It also has 3 eyelids. Amazing, right? It might, and really thick eyelashes to keep the dust out of its eyes. So if it didn't have thick eyelashes and there was a dust storm, it probably would be damaged and not survive long enough to reproduce. It has different size legs, and legs are really huge for running at high speeds, right, and developing defensive kicks. And these things also, they're bare, right? They don't have any feathers on them, so it's to keep them cool while the ostrich is running. So the legs are really important. So what's really important is that you, whatever scenario you put together, you indicated why that adaptation maybe was important and how it could help that particular animal survive long enough for it to produce offspring that are able to produce more offspring, right, with that similar trait, so that it can grow the population, and in each generation that trait maybe gets better, okay, for survival. All right. So in a plant that might be important too, like for example, a cactus, again, right, in desert heat would last quite long, right, like hundreds of years, whereas like an oak tree in a desert is not going to last because there's not enough water, right? So certain plants can live in a desert and certain plants can live in a forest, but they don't decide where to live. It's just what happens is they're in that spot, and then because they're in that spot, generation after generation helps them to the ones that survive pass those better traits on to the offspring, and then the offspring are able to reproduce and survive long enough to reproduce. And if by chance they have a trait that's worthy of passing and keeps them alive, awesome. We did a lab using math to support how natural selection affects individual probabilities of survival. Hopefully you have, and this is where we talked about adaptation a little bit and like why something might adapt. And we hid 2 moths in plain sight. We used color to camouflage, and we talked about how a predator will enter the room and eat all the moths it can find, and we calculated from a total population the number of survivors and the percentage of survival rate, right? And so what we found out is the bright moth is not going to live long enough to produce offspring and pass the bright color trait to another generation. And over time, natural selection will make the bright color moth a minority. It won't eliminate it altogether, but it will not be like the one that you find in general, okay? If there were no predators, would the moth color change? It probably would here and there and fluctuate, but it would probably be kept relatively simple unless it was related to some form of disease or something, right? Okay, that's it, 97. That's your last notebook page to review before the test. Today, make sure that you ask questions, use your notebook, go over the study guide before you start the test, and good luck on the test.